We continue now at the top of Daf Zayin and Beis Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf. On the previous summit, the Gemara asked, what is the source that if an onen brings a carbon, that carbon is disqualified? And the Gemara now brings the source from Tanna Devei Rabbi Yishmael. It was taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yishmael that the source is a kal v'chomer from Baal Mum. And the Gemara here continues, Baal Mum sha'ochel, Baal Mum, again, he's able to eat kodshei kodshim, but im avad chila, but if he does the avod in the Beis HaMikdash, so then we say it's profaned, we say that it's disqualified. So onen, so when it comes to an acute mourner, she'eno ochel, who does not eat kodshei kodshim, eino din shem avad chila, isn't it logical to say that if he does the avoda, it is profaned? Rashi explains, she'eno ochel dichsiv, that's written in Pasuk, lo achalti ba'oni, it says that I didn't eat it ba'oni while I was an onen, and so therefore that's the source that there's no achila. So again, you have a kal v'chomer from Baal Mum. But the Gemara says, Mala Baal Mum, but what's unique about a Baal Mum, a Kohen with a blemish, shekein asabo kraven kimakriven, these are the same arguments that were brought on the previous summit, that by a Baal Mum, it's true not only by the Kohen, but it's also true by the kraven, it's also true by the animals themselves that are offered. There's a halacha that a mum, that a blemish can disqualify, so you can't learn from Baal Mum. And the Gemara says, Zor yochiach, Zor, a non-Kohen will prove the other way. Mal is Zor, but what's unique about a Zor, shekein ein lo takana, a Zor, there is no takana, there is no solution. Rashi here explains, ein lo takana v'onen, when it comes to an acute mourner, yesh lo takana l'machar, the next day, meaning when he's no longer an onen, he'll be able to bring a carbon. That, of course, is not true by a Zor, non-Kohen, is not going to become a Kohen, so you can't learn straight from Zor. Baal Mum yochiach, Baal Mum will prove the other way. The Chazar hadin, and so we go back and forth, lo roizeh koroizeh, v'lo roizeh koroizeh, this one is not like that one is not like this one, and therefore Atzar Hashav Shevahen, the common denominator among them, Shehin Muzharin, that they are warned, V'im Avdu Chilalo, and if they do the avoda, it's profaned, it's disqualified. Afani Avi Onen, so too I can include an Onen Shemuzar, that he is warned, V'im Avad Chilal, and if he does do the avoda, then it is profaned. The Gemara says, Heichon Muzar, where do we find a warning for an Onen? Ilem, if you're going to say me umin hamikdash lo yetze, from umin hamikdash lo yetze, now that was one of the sources brought on the previous Amud, and that the source over there was that the Kohen Gadol, he continues to do the avoda when he is an onen, and so we infer that a Kohen Handiot does not. But the problem is chilul begufe ksiv bey. It actually says chilul in that pasuk. That was one of the sources actually that the avoda is profane. That was an alternative view, and so therefore that cannot be the source for the warning, because then that would be the full source. So ella rather mihein hikrivu, rather it's from the pasuk of hein hikrivu, again that was concerning the death of Nadav and Avihu, because Savar, and so he holds mivnei aninos nisrafa, that was the situation over there. The reason why the carbon was burned was because it was aninos, it was because they were in acute mourning over Nadav and Avihu, and so that becomes the source. And Rashi explains, Chilul begufe ksiv, in that pasuk it actually says Chilul kevin de dayakt, because if we're inferring from that pasuk, ha'acher shelo yatsa, that if somebody else, when it comes to a different Kohen, not a Kohen Gadol, so then shelo yatsa, the gears over here should be Chilul, that it is profaned. That was the inference on the previous Amud. Kal v'chomer su lamalach, you don't need the kal v'chomer anymore. The whole point over here is that you have a kal v'chomer, you just need to find the warning. And so then the Gemara said, v'kasavar, that the Talmud Devei Rabbi Yishmael holds, mipnei aninos nisrafa, that it's because of aninos that it was burned, shelo hayu lo ochlim uchid, meaning there was no one to eat the carbon, like I explained, and that's why it was burned. Uchesha amru lo mifnei aninos sarfanu, and when they said to him that we did it because of aninos, Rashi now explains what was going on over there in the conversation. He made a mistake, because savar shikrivua onanim, he thought that they had actually offered the carbon as onanim. V'yamar lahem, so he said to them, shema ba'aninos shikrivua, maybe you offered it ba'aninos. And so therefore, again, you see from there that there's a warning against offering baninos. Now Rashi notes, Umiyu, nevertheless, chilul lo yolef Rabbi Yishmael minei. The Talmud Devei Rabbi Yishmael does not learn the idea that if you offer it baninos, it's profaned. That's not a source. Di'ilav, because if not, and the Shinuye Nuschos puts in over here, Di'ilav kal v'chomer, if not for the kal v'chomer, havamina, one would have thought, Hayda Amar Lahu Shema ba'aninos hikraftem oso, that when he said to them, maybe you brought it baninos, lav l'meimer, wasn't to say, Di'avid hachi shaper istrif, that if that's what happened, that you brought up aninos, it should have been burned. That's not necessarily what Moshe Rabbeinu was saying. Ela kishamru lo, rather when they said to him, Ipnei aninos sarfanu, that we burned it because of aninos, Amar Lahem, he said to them, Shema avartem al ha'azara, maybe you transgressed the warning, v'hikravtem onanim, and you brought it as onanim, v'yamar lo Aaron, and then again in the conversation, Aaron then says to him, he says to Moshe Rabbeinu, v'chihein hikrivu, did they bring it to asurim l'hakrav onanim? They're not allowed to bring it as onanim. Ani hikrafti, I'm the one that brought it. She'en aninos posel, since I'm the Kohen Gadol, aninos is not a disqualification for me. But the Gemara continues and asks, "Ikol mifrach," but we can refute this tzad hashav as follows: Ma'alat tzad hashav shebehen. But the common denominator among them is shekein lo hutra michlalan. That they're not hutra michlalan means essentially there's no exceptions where something is permitted. Again, by an onen, there's an exception by a kohen gadol that a kohen gadol is allowed to bring a carbon as an onen. You don't have those kinds of exceptions when it comes to balmum, when it comes to zar, so you shouldn't be able to learn from them. Rashi explains lo hutra michlalan zar u balmum michlal isuran shenesru b'mikdash, again by a zar and non-kohen, and by a balmum a kohen with a blemish. So there's that prohibition in the mikdash lo hutru eitzel shum carbon v'lo eitzel shum adam. There's no heter by any particular carbon where there's an exception, and there's no heter by any individual where there's an exception. Tomar ba'onen, whereas by onen shehuter michlolo eitzel kohen gadol, that there is an exception. It's permitted by a kohen gadol. And the Gemara continues, Tamei yochiach, Tamei can prove the other way. If a Tamei brings a carbon, that carbon is disqualified. And there we do have a concept of huter michlolo. Rashi says, Tamei yochiach shehuter michlolo eitzel carbon sibor. We have huter michlolo by a carbon sibor. A carbon sibor, a public carbon, is able to be brought betuma dechsib b'moado, because it's written in the pasuk, it has to be brought in its time. The carbon is brought in its time. V'afilu betuma, we learn from there, even betuma, the carbon is brought. V'im avad b'carbon yachid chilal, but by a carbon yachid, by a private carbon, again, the person is tamei. So then we say chilal, then we say it's profaned. It is disqualified, so we can prove from tamei. But ma'ala tamei shekein metamei. But again, tamei is unique because a tamei person can cause tuma to something else. That was again mentioned on the previous amud. And so hanach yochichu. So those other cases we had, they will prove the other way. Again, zar and balmum. Again, v'chazra. Then you go back and forth. Hatzara shava shabahen. The common denominator is shemuzharan, that they are warned, and again that the avoda is profane. It's disqualified. And so the same will be true when it comes to an onen. But the Gemara continues and asks, "V'lifroch mal hatzad hashava shebehen shekein lo hutru michlolon eitzel kohen gadol b'karban yachid." Why can't we ask that the common denominator, there is no exception where it's permitted by a kohen gadol, by a private carbon, and so again you still do have a distinction between these three cases and the case of onen. But the Gemara says that's not a refutation. Shem tuma mio ishtaroi. Still, in general, we do see that there is hutter michlolo by tuma in general, again by carbon sibor, and that is enough. Rashi explains, Shem tuma mia ishtaroi, tuma in general can sometimes be permitted. Again, kegon b'tzibor, for example, in public with a communal carbon, hilkach lav pirchahi. Therefore, it's not a refutation. V'ikasha. Now, if you're going to ask as follows, says Rashi, lama li lameimar tamei yochiach. Why do we have to say tamei yochiach? Why do we have to say that tamei is a case where you have hutter mechlolo? Bezar nami mashkachas lo dehutter shem zaras b'bama. By a zar, also by a non-kohen, we said that is permissible by a bama, by an altar that's outside of the Beis HaMikdash. A carbon can be brought by a zar. And so what do we even need to bring in tamei over here? And so Rashi says, Ein ze hutter mechlolo. That's actually not called hutter mechlolo. Sharei lo nesar shamayolim, because there was never a prohibition in the first place by a bama. In order to be hutter mechlolo, there has to be a prohibition and then an exception made where it's permitted. Aval onen hutter mechlolo, but by an onen, by an acute mourner, that is hutter mechlolo. Sharei nesar b'mikdash eitzel kohen hedyot, because it is prohibited in the mikdash by a kohen hedyot, and so there's an exception where it's permitted by a kohen gadol. And the Gemara continues with another source that when an onen brings a carbon, it's disqualified. Rav Mesharshia Amar, Rav Mesharshia says, Asya b'kal v'chomer mi Yoshev. We can learn it out, a kal v'chomer from Yoshev. That's again a kohen who's bringing a carbon sitting down. Uma Yoshev she'ochel. When it comes to someone sitting down, he can eat from kodshei kodshim, im avad chilal, but if he does the avod in that fashion, it is profaned. Onen she'eno ochel. When it comes to an onen who cannot eat from kodshei kodshim, eno din shem avad chilal, isn't it logical to say that if he does the avoda, it is profaned? And the Gemara again says, as it said in the previous Amud, Mali Yoshev Shekain Pasol Le'edus. But what's unique about a Yoshev, one sitting down, a person is disqualified from testifying sitting down. And the Gemara says, Mi Yoshev Talmud Chacham. Well, we can learn it out from a Talmud Chacham who's sitting, who is allowed to testify. But the Gemara says, Mal L'Shem Yoshev Shekain Pasol Le'edus. But what we can say in general about someone sitting down, there's a general disqualification for testimony. And the Gemara says, Shem Yoshev Lo Parach. We don't ask questions from the general situation of sitting down. V'yimtim salom ar parach, and even if you do say that we ask such a question, asya miyoshev u'mechada mehanach. We can learn it out from a combination of yoshev and one of the other cases we brought before. Again, for example, learning it out from tamei or balmum or zar in combination with yoshev. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, again, onein pasel, an acute mourner is disqualified. Again, that's if he does one of the avodos of the carbon, then the carbon is disqualified. And the Gemara says, Amar Rava, Rava says, and the Shinui Nuschos has a gear, so Amar Rabba, Rabba says, Lo shanu ela bekarban yachid. When we say an onein is pasel, that it's disqualified, that's only by a private carbon. Avol bekarban sibor, but by a public carbon, by a communal carbon, miratza, then it would be accepted. And how do we know that? Kal v'chomer mituma. We know that because we can make a kal v'chomer from a situation of bringing a carbon betuma. Umatuma shalohutra mechlala eitzel kohen gadol, if by tuma, where there's no exception that it should be permitted by a kohen gadol, bekarban yachid, by a private carbon, hutra eitzel hedyot bekarban sibor, but we know that tuma is permitted by a regular kohen, by a communal carbon. So aninos, so when it comes to aninos, when it comes to acute mourning, shahutra mechlala eitzel kohen gadol bekarban yachid, which is permitted, there's an exception by a kohen gadol, by a private carbon, eino din shahutra eitzel kohen hedyot bekarban sibor. Isn't it logical to say it's permitted by a regular kohen, by a communal carbon? And so essentially what the argument over here is since we have a kal v'chomer, even though in general we have a source that an onein is possible, but we should be able to use a kal v'chomer to say that by carbon sibor, an onein's carbon would in fact be accepted. But the Gemara continues, Maskif law Rava bar Ahiloi. Rava bar Ahiloi asks on this, if you're willing to make a kal v'chomer to go against the general sense of, let's say, a disqualification in the pasuk, so then we can make other kal v'chomers in theory. We can say as follows, for example, Lo tutar aninos eitzel kohen gadol bekarban yachid. We can argue that aninos should not be permitted by a kohen gadol, by a private carbon, mi kal v'chomer, because you can make a kal v'chomer. Umatoma shehutra eitzel kohen hedyot betzibor, if by tuma, which is permitted, there's an exception by a regular kohen, by a communal carbon, lo hutra eitzel kohen gadol bekarban yachid, but it's not permitted by a kohen gadol, by a private carbon. So aninos, by acute mourning, shelo hutra eitzel kohen hedyot bekarban sibor, which is not permitted by a regular kohen, by a carbon sibor, eino din shelo tutar eitzel kohen gadol bekarban yachid. So we should say it's logical that it should not be permitted by a kohen gadol, by a private carbon. And likewise, if you want to make these kinds of arguments, v'tutar tuma eitzel kohen gadol bekarban yachid mikal v'chomer, we can say that tuma by a kohen gadol, by a private carbon, should be permitted from a kal v'chomer as follows: Uma aninos shelo hutar eitzel kohen hedyot bekarban sibor. If by aninos, which is not permitted by a regular kohen, by a public carbon, a communal carbon, hutra eitzel kohen gadol bekarban yachid, that is permitted by a kohen gadol, by a private carbon. So tuma shehutra eitzel kohen hedyot bekarban sibor, tuma, which is permitted by a regular kohen, by a carbon sibor, eino din shehutra eitzel kohen gadol bekarban yachid. Isn't it logical that that should be permitted by a kohen gadol, by a carbon yachid? And similarly, we can argue, v'lo tutar tuma eitzel kohen hedyot bekarban sibor mikal v'chomer. We can say that tuma should not be permitted by a regular kohen, by a carbon sibor, from the following kal v'chomer: Uma aninos shehutra eitzel kohen gadol bekarban yachid. If by aninos, which is permitted by a kohen gadol, by carbon yachid, lo hutra eitzel kohen hedyot bekarban sibor, but aninos is not permitted by a kohen hedyot, by a carbon sibor. So tuma shelo hutra eitzel kohen gadol bekarban yachid, tuma which is not permitted by a kohen gadol, by a carbon yachid, eino din shelo tutar bekohen hedyot bekarban sibor. Isn't it logical to say it shouldn't be permitted by a kohen hedyot and by a carbon sibor? And so therefore, again, once you're making these kal v'chomers, you can choose all kinds of kal v'chomers to make, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph.